Hey, welcome back. It's Bob. Thanks for coming back to Let's Talk. Let's talk about scaling a business. Come on. Hey, welcome back to the show. I'm glad everybody's tuning us back in. One of the things that I think I've got a lot of questions on and I wanted to talk about today, which I think will benefit a bunch of people, is how do you actually go about scaling a business? And it sounds easy, but it's not. And we'll get into the nuances of it. But I think it's a question a lot of people go through. And quite frankly, there's some nuances. And in my opinion, it's not just about running a business. It's about having the understanding of how to lead your team and the people around you in that business on top of the business enterprise type, kind of assets that you have to have and you have to do. I ran a private sector company for years. I was also the chairman of the board, and I've seen it come from a little teeny company all the way up to a really big company. And in that growth process, there's a bunch of things that go on. And so I think we can touch a lot of this today, but I will tell you, this is how important I think it is. Rapid expansion of any business can either propel that business high or it can absolutely tear it apart. And unfortunately, when it tears it apart, there's all kinds of implications that come with that, not to mention all the jobs and the people that lose their jobs. But it's something that is that important. And really, I wanted to share my opinion today why most businesses stumble like that, why they grow too fast, and what really it takes to scale and adapt a business in a sustainable way.
Bob, I think this is a really important topic.
Hey, Katy, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. I'm wearing my Skechers today.
Nice.
So I've got them on. I'm kicking with Skechers.
Comfortable. Well, I'm excited to get into this topic. I think it's an important one. I'm curious from your perspective. A lot of times when you think of scaling a business, you think of revenue, you think of sales, you think of number of employees. You've worked in leadership roles in both the public and private sector. Is there a difference between the two of them?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I have experience throughout my career, whether it's a state level, federal level, or different types of private sector companies, right? Either private sector companies or companies that are publicly traded. And I think there is a big difference. In state budgets, and you're working with state systems, they're really fixed for long periods of time until budgets can be approved. So when you talk about scaling any type of state infrastructure, the process is going to be different because it's not necessarily around you're going to be able to move people immediately, or you're going to be able to move processes. It's more around moving what you can sustain through the budgetary cycles, because there's no way that you can keep a business running by taking things off of certain things. When you get to the government, it's really a lot different. I mean, the government's a big monster. There's a bunch of organizations, trillions of dollars worth of money being spent. But even in the FBI years ago, when I was way up high in there, our budgets would be set 3 years in advance. And so you may want, item A or item B, and you put it in for the budgetary request. But the problem is, by the time the budget gets approved, that piece of equipment that you wanted to buy or something you want to do to scale the organization in a certain area, you can't even afford it. And so there's different things that you can do by moving bodies and rearranging the structure, but it's harder when it comes to monetary things. In private sector, when I came out of the government, I actually thought I was like Rain Man, because when I came out and went into the private sector and I went to my first company and I was running this giant cyber practice globally, when I wanted new infrastructure, when I wanted new equipment, when I wanted anything, the boss was like, go buy it today. There was no like 3 bids. There was no like this, that, or the other. So when you're doing that and you're increasing the workload on whatever process that you have in place, back then I didn't realize it until I went through it many times. There's a whole point to that. You can move faster in the private sector. I think it's a perfect example. Like NASA is not building rockets to go to Mars. A private sector company is. Why? We haven't even been back to the moon, right? And so when you look at those kind of things, comparison between private sector and government, I think that's what strikes me the most, quite frankly. But the reality is, in the private sector, it can also hurt you by moving that fast. I don't think you want to stifle creativity. That's not what anybody wants to do. But I think you have to be in a place where you can see the vision, understand it, and we'll talk about how you get there. without really kind of destroying the company or taking the company down. I think there's 3 points really when we talk about, growth and scaling a company. I think there's 3 kind of places where a company falls. Most people that's listening to this, they're going to go out and launch a new business and you're all excited and you're bringing your new business online. And I think that's very, very excitable and a very happy time for most people. But then you have to sustain the business. And that may come months, years later, where the business actually has a sustainable model and that it can make revenue, it can make whatever targets you're setting. And that's where the work really starts, quite frankly. And then there's the scaling part of the business. And when you talk about scaling a company, what I see a lot of people not really think about, it really requires a level of foresight, a strategy. You have to be able to adapt to challenges that you don't even know is going to happen. You have to really take that time when you're in the leadership portion of scaling any company, because the growth, to me, is not synonymous with success. You don't grow just to grow. I think a lot of people get to the point where we need to expand. And you've got to be looking at your people, your products, your revenue, and your scaling capacity.
So when it comes to leadership, leading through the scaling phase, why are so many people failing?
I think it really comes down, quite frankly, people, leaders in businesses, yeah, especially in a scaling company, you have to have a bunch of traits. And I think leaders are looking solely at business metrics instead of looking at the complexities of running people. Anytime you bring people into anything, it becomes more complex, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And nobody likes to change, meaning a person. And if you don't believe me, take the person that's sitting in your company, has been sitting in the same pod for the last 5 years, and tell him or her they got to move one pod over. They will have an absolute nervous breakdown. Most people don't like any kind of change. And so people, I think, fail, Katy, quite frankly, because they're looking at business metrics. And business metrics is only part of this. The role of the leadership team in scaling a business is monumental, in my opinion. You can't get around it. And by the way, and I may hit this a couple times in this talk, I mean, the ability of leaders to grow with a company may or may not be there. You may need to change the leadership team out. You may need to change your processes out. And so there's a lot to that. A company's systems and structures, just because they're running good today, doesn't mean that they're going to have the ability to grow where you want to go or your vision as the boss. And you have to make sure that that stuff's in place. It's all connected. People, process, revenue, and stress.
I get it. I get completely what you're saying. But where should leaders be focused on then?
I think you got to focus first on your vision, and then you got to focus on your people. And along the way, you're going to pick up all your business metrics before you launch. In contrast, leadership and the capabilities of the leadership team are so important in scaling a business. It's one of the most natural things I think people actually forget about. When you back off and you go, why did people come here when we were a little company? Well, the difference is they came there most likely for the people. They came there for the bosses. They came there for the work. And so you have to remember that they're part of this journey. It's just not about selling more widgets or making more money or growing your margin or getting out of the debt phase of your business and into the profitable revenue phase. I think it's all about looking at and setting up, do we have the expertise from the bottom to the top? And this requires courage as a leader. Because sometimes as a leader, you may figure out you're not the right guy or gal to be in that position right now. And I got to tell you, I probably know the amount of people that would bail out of a situation like that and actually say, you know what, we're going to go into this next phase of a company, but I don't need to be there because I'm not the best guy or gal.
But that's an important point. And I think to be able to have that self-awareness, and I don't think it's always that common because you stick with the company, you're at the top leadership role in a startup environment, you have that founder's mentality, but to have that recognition that I may not be the right leader to take it, to the next chapter, to the next phase of growth.
It's a big deal. And I'm telling you, that's a conversation. Nobody, by the way, I don't know of hardly anybody that does this. And I would recommend that this is one of the things you have to take as any leader, and I talk a lot about this in leadership conversations, you really need to critically review yourself as well as everybody on the team. And why is if you truly want the company to scale, if you truly want the company to grow and become whatever, it doesn't matter, whatever the vision is, right? You have to look at the people that are there. And I'm telling you, a lot of people don't take that and do it because if you asked anybody, and I've done this many times, if you asked anybody, am I a good leader? Am I a good listener?
Mm.
Nobody says no.
Yeah.
Nobody says I'm a horrible leader. I'm a terrible listener. The reality is, you may be, or you may not have the skill set to take the company to the next level. And so you may have all the business processes in place, but if you've not taken the time to make sure and had a really honest, unfiltrated conversation with yourself as well as your other leaders, that you might not take that time to actually put that in place. And the other thing I got to tell you, the one thing that I think is imperative, and in one phase of my career, I didn't do it and I should have done it. And in the last couple companies I was involved in, I did it repetitively. You have to go through some type, in my opinion, of a kind of scale checklist, right? And what I mean by that is it doesn't need to be a minute figures yet. What I'm saying is when I'm looking at what I'm running or what I'm involved in or what we're trying to do from the vision of the leadership or the board or whoever, it doesn't matter. I need to make sure that the strength of my operations can support that, right? I need to test the culture, right? Do these 100 people or 5,000 people want to follow me? Now, maybe they do, maybe they don't. What are you going to do about that? How about your financial resilience? What if something goes wrong? You go headlong into the scaling process, and next thing you know, you're out of money, right? Because nothing costs what you think it's going to cost when you make the projections. I mean, it's just the way I figured it out over the last several years. It always creeps in more cost here, more cost there. And then I think one of the biggest things is prepping for who's the next set of leaders and why do we need those skills? And I think that really is refining the whole scaling strategy. And remember, growth for growth's sake is not a strategy.
I get it completely. I was recently just talking to a mid-cap company, and they were having problems with morale and burn rate at this time.
I don't doubt it at all. I've seen it over and over and over again. And let's face facts. Most small companies, and again, it doesn't matter if you're 50 people or 5,000. Nowadays, that can be considered a small, company. I mean, the mid-cap companies have moved so much over the years on what their revenue is compared to what it was 10 or 15 years ago. You can have a clear vision. You can have a clear growth strategy. But I'm telling you, as a leader, when it comes to scaling a business, I can't say enough about over-communication. You have to over-communicate on everything you're thinking about. You can tell them what you told them, tell them what you just said, tell them what you said a minute ago, and I guarantee you there's still half the company has no idea what you're talking about. And I think what also is important with scaling that business when it comes around chasing the growth, chasing the cost, you have to look at when we set the leadership team up for success in the coming years and we set the company up for success with whatever type of strategy or whatever we're trying to sell. When we get into the scaling part of it, it's a long haul. Like you don't just scale for like 2 months and then the company changes and you're up and running again like a brand new company. In most cases, this takes years. And so you have to look for a long haul. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, and you run the races different. And so you really have to take that time and you have to look and you have to say, look, what's my core principles? What's my core clarity and vision for the team when it comes to the scaling? And you have to over-communicate that. Companies that scale and grow successfully have all these things. And they do it forever. Let me give you a perfect example. And this is a great contrast to what you brought up earlier, Katy, about, state government, federal government, private sector government. I, like a lot of people, was in the United States intelligence community back at September 11th. I was in the FBI. And I can tell you that in days, because when I first went into the FBI, we did some other things, but we did a lot of gangs, a lot of drug work, a lot of bank robberies, a lot of criminal stuff. And I'm not saying we weren't doing other things, but that was a majority of what we were doing. No cyber. It was unheard of back in those days. But after 9/11, that organization, meaning the FBI, had to change thousands of resources in days all over the world to focus on counterterrorism, right? And the chances are, even back then, Your money's not coming tomorrow. Your infrastructure is not coming tomorrow. I can tell you it would never change the whole time I was there. Your IT systems aren't coming tomorrow. They're archaic, quite frankly. I don't know what they are nowadays, but when I left compared to the private sector. But you now have to change thousands of people working different jobs all around terrorism, domestic terrorism, foreign terrorism, international terrorism. And you can't drop any of the other responsibilities. You can't stop working bank robberies. You can't stop working gangs. You can't stop working international whatever. And so you can move bodies and move structure, but you need to anticipate, and this is one of the last things I really wanted to talk about, is what can you do in case of emergency, but what are you going to be needing, right? Because you're not going to get all this overnight. And I think that's one of the most perfect, and by the way, God bless the men and the women that did all that back then. It wasn't just a bureau, it was all USIC was changing. But that's a perfect example, I think.
I remember the dramatic change and impact that 9/11 had on the organization and its, need and how it moved forward. For business leaders that may be listening to this podcast today, they're getting ready to scale. They know it's going to be hard. What should they really be focused on at this time?
And this is my opinion only, but I will tell you from experience, you need to have from the very beginning, as any type of leader in any part of the company, I don't care where you're at the tippy top all the way down to the bottom, there needs to be a vision. And the vision of where we're going needs to be narrowly defined. Now, by the way, this doesn't mean like stifle creativity, stifle people with great ideas. That's not what I'm saying. That stuff still keeps flowing. But you need to have a crystal clear, well-definable vision. And that vision needs to be not only talked about, but ingrained in the culture of the company from the top to the bottom. Because if somebody thinks you're going left when you're going right, this all fails. Especially the bigger the company, I can just tell you from the government, and I've worked with thousands of private sector company since I've been retired from the government, been out in the private sector for years, that the bigger the company, the harder this is. You got to look at it like a big boat. Takes them 3 miles to make a right turn, right? And so the vision is unbelievably important in this. And then it needs to be clear and actionable. It can't be this fluffy, nebulous stuff. When it comes to a company, it needs to be a razor's point, and it needs to be actionable. So the people that are on that team and running that company and pushing to scale this business knows what their jobs are. Whatever that is. It doesn't matter if your job is to take out the trash, bring the coffee, think of corporate goals. It has no bearing. You have to have clear and actionable objectives. Everybody in the company. Communicate, 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 communicate. You cannot talk about the vision and where the company's going enough. Because I will tell you, you'll do it. And I can tell you from being way, way high up in the government, being way high up in companies, you can say it again, say it one more time, and half the company still doesn't know what you're talking about. I could say it's beautiful blue skies out. Bob said it was cloudy yesterday. So you have to over-communicate. And then the last thing I would say to anybody out there is scale with a purpose. Don't just scale. Don't just hire to hire. You've got to have a purpose and a plan. And I think that's one of the biggest things.
I think that idea of clarity comes straight to mind again in all those points.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it really does. And I think, for what it's worth, I think that was a good conversation. So, hey, thanks again for tuning in to Let's Talk. I'm Bob. Can't wait to see you again. Until I talk to you next time, peace, man. Love each other. We need it.